So today we're going to begin talking about the systems, in particular the nervous system, which is pretty complex. We're going to try to simplify as much as possible. So the nervous system really is its responsibility is to control and coordinate all the functions of the body in some way, shape, or form. I hope you can see that it's pretty important. It analyzes stimuli, whether there's things going on externally, like changes in light, changes in temperature, you name it, but things that are going on internally as well. It analyzes things as being painful or things that are pleasurable or anything thereof. Recognizes faces, names, you name it. It's ultimately a pretty complex system in its own right. And it responds to those stimuli in however possible ways it can. Uh, Removing yourself from injury or being able to communicate with other people to moving the body however it sees fit. It's really, again, and responsible ultimately for controlling everything. So your nervous system is really two systems within a system. There is your central nervous system, or sometimes called the CNS, and then there is your peripheral nervous system, sometimes called the PNS. So we'll talk about the central nervous system first. Its basic job is to relay impulses back and forth from the brain to the rest of the body. It's really where the information is processed and analyzed, and information is gathered and processed. And really, it's your brain and spinal cord, in particular your brain, but your spinal cord as well. So any pain, we're going to talk about this in a minute, is actually determined in the brain, or anything else you're recognizing and feeling is really determined in the brain, because that's where ultimately everything's analyzed and realized. All right, and a little side note about your brain is actually divided into two hemispheres, a left and a right. All right, now there's some debate about whether we think with a left versus our right, but what we do know is that the left side of your brain, your left hemisphere, actually controls the right side of your body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. So if you are a righty, you're actually processing that movement with your left side of your brain. So again, if you are twiddling your fingers on the right hand, it's actually being controlled by the left side of your brain, and vice versa. If you're going to wiggle your left hand, the fingers of your left hand, it's being controlled by the right side of your brain, your right hemisphere. All right. Now, your peripheral nervous system is everything else. So as you can tell in this human here, they're the nerve cords that ultimately run from your spine to pretty much every reach of your body, to every surface cell is a connection somehow. And basically what it does is it relays information from the environment back to the central nervous system. And branches of these cells that we're going to talk about today, called neurons, from the spine to pretty much all the parts of the body. Almost every part of your body, every inch of your body has neurons nearby to receive information. And it relays the information to the central nervous system. And basically what happens is it relays impulses also from the central nervous system to the appropriate parts of the body, whether it be a muscle or a gland or a particular organ, to function the way the brain wants it to function. So in our little analogy here, here's again the general differences between the central nervous system. So we have basically, again, the brain spinal cord as a central nervous system, and then the peripheral nervous system are all these other strings of nerve cells that radiate from the spine all the way down to all the way down to your feet, to your hands, you name it. Now let's say hypothetically, your hand was over a fire, and believe it or not, you don't feel the pain instantaneously. So the fire will trigger the neurons to react. All right, it triggers a pain response, and that response will be sent to the brain. Now, obviously, very quickly, but your brain will then process what's going on. Like, is this good? Is this bad? Okay, it's bad. What is it? Is it cold? Is it sharp? Yada yada yada. Oh no, this is hot, and hot's bad, and I don't want to put my hand anywhere near a fire. Yada yada yada. Now again, this happens very quickly. You're talking, fractions of a fraction of a second, but it's really your brain that realizes the pain, and then once it realizes that there is pain, it sends the impulse back to the appropriate muscles, or perhaps you can pardon my animation, causing your arm to be moved away from the fire. So, albeit you think that pain is instantaneous, or any other feeling for that matter, it's really not. It's the brain that realizes that it exists before it's really known to exist. So there is also kind of a third system called the autonomic nervous system. And this controls all the automatic, involuntary functions of the body. Luckily, things we don't really have to think about, things that happen on their own. So a classic example is that the brain controls the heart. It tells the heart to beat at a certain rate. Whether you are walking, whether you're sleeping, whether you're fighting with your wife, it's always there. And luckily, we don't have to think about it. If we did, I don't know if we'd all be here today. Um, excuse me. Other functions, for instance, digestion of food. Excuse me. Even breathing is obviously somewhat involuntary too. Albeit I know you can hold your breath, but you don't really have to think about breathing. Your autonomic nervous system controls that. So let's start talking about the neurons themselves, the very complex cells that are used in the nervous system. So there are really two types of neurons. There are sensory neurons that transmit impulses to the central nervous system. And the way they're wired is it's like a road. You can only go one way on a road. And these neurons are wired to send a message only towards the brain and the spinal cord. The other ones are the motor neurons, and they send the impulses away from the brain and the spinal cord. All right, so they work hand in hand because the sensory will send the message to the appropriate part of the brain. The brain realizes what it needs to do, sends the message back through motor neurons to the appropriate muscles. This is a picture of a neuron, obviously taken with a very fancy camera. This is more of a cartoony one, but it is a pretty complex cell. Now notice that it does have a nucleus. It's got a cell body like every other cell, but it's pretty strange looking, obviously, beyond that. Now around the cell body, there are these little branches called dendrites. All right, and then there's this long arm called the axon, with the end of it being like what they call the axon terminals. All right, and how this works is the axon of one neuron will transmit impulses to the dendrites of the next neuron. So it travels from the cell body out through the axon. And if you bring in another cell, it travels from cell to cell to cell, always entering through the dendrites and always exiting through the axon. All right, now they're not touching, and that's pretty important, as we'll see in a minute. But there's a small gap. I know it looks pretty huge here, but there's a small gap between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of the next, and that gap is called the synapse. All right, what happens in the synapse is that the neuron, the previous neuron, transmits or releases these chemicals called neurotransmitters. And there's different neurotransmitters for different feelings, pain, pleasure, you name it. All right, and what happens is it ultimately doesn't jump from cell to cell. The impulse triggers the release of neurotransmitters, which will then trigger an impulse in the next cell to travel the length of the cell and so on and so forth. Now, as much as this sounds like it takes forever, it actually happens like that, like a snap, if you will. It's that quick. So, do any kind of movement with your own body, your brain sent a message from your brain to the appropriate muscles. It doesn't take forever. It happens instantaneously. But in the billions of neurons between your brain and the particular muscles you may just move to snap, it's doing that over and over again, traveling the length of a neuron, releasing neurotransmitters, which trigger an impulse in the next neuron, and so on and so forth. All right, now there's a little picture here. The synapse is actually much smaller than this. All right, but we have here the neurotransmitters being secreted, triggering the impulse in the next one. This would be the dendrite. This would be the axon. All right, here's a little artistic picture as well. And those neurotransmitters is important because that's where the messages are being made. And some of the medicines out there are basically used to block certain neurotransmitters to be travel for, like for instance, certain painkillers will actually get in that synapse and prevent the pain message from getting to the brain. Not to say your body is not going through pain, but that you don't feel it. And believe it or not, if that message doesn't get to the brain, if it's blocked in the gap between neurons, then it's never going to get there. And your brain won't realize it, and you won't feel pain as much as your body technically may be injured.